Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's lunchtime York Festival of Ideas event on science, poetry and imagination. My name is Tom McLeish. I'm Professor of Natural Philosophy in the Physics Department at York Uni, which also, as well as doing physics, allows me to explore links and connections between science and the humanities, social sciences and beyond, which we're doing today. Particular welcome to this second event in our series sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation on science, imagination and the big questions, in which we explore many of those connections. This event actually had its genesis, in a way, 2 years ago at the York Festival of Ideas, where I, at that point, as a scientist, had got concerned that we don't speak enough, or science doesn't talk enough about the role of imagination in what scientists do. It often is portrayed as a rather formulaic exercise, but we have to reimagine the universe. Now, I wrote a book about it, gratuitous advert number 1 coming up. Science, I can't remember the title of my book, Poetry, Music and Science, it was. Science and Imagination and Creativity. Now, at that event and following it, I had a few complaints. Some of the complaints were that with poetry on the title, under the Trade Descriptions Act, it ought to have talked more about poetry between the covers, which it really didn't. Though I did quote William Wordsworth saying that one day science, as much as any other human activity, would inspire future poetry. I more or less had come to the conclusion that that hadn't occurred yet. Then, at that festival day, I met Anna Phoebe, a musician, composer, who's been inspired by science and science poetry and other poetry to explore performative connections between these. Many of you will have caught her awesome, moving introductory event recorded at York Minster at the beginning of the festival. If you haven't, go check it out. She had also been engaged in collaborations in genetics and cancer and in climate change, which is recorded in her album Between Worlds. Then, Northern UK poet Katrina Porteous very kindly sent me this anthology, Edge, which contains poems with titles like Field, Quantum, Higgs. There's even a poem about one of Jupiter's moons. And she writes that this was a celebration of the miracle of being alive, an attempt to create a less anthropocentric poetry of nature. Priest, poet, theologian, and Coleridge scholar Malcolm Guite kept bumping into me, or I kept bumping into him, and he kept pointing me to Samuel Taylor Coleridge and a whole wealth of 19th century romantic richness on science and poetry and beyond. And to his wonderful book, Faith, Hope and Poetry, in which he mentions philosopher Mary Midgley's book, Science and Poetry, and says, I want to support and illustrate her thesis that the poetic imagination is fully engaged in the scientific endeavor. So I was learning very rapidly, and then along came Sam Illingworth's book on biographies of scientists who write poetry themselves. Sam is himself also not only an author, an academic, he's also the founding editor of the first journal dedicated to science poetry, Consilience. He's associate professor in academic practice at Edinburgh, Napier University. Now, the great thing is that all those people are here with me today on this panel, and indeed, here they are. And what we're going to do together is to explore the connections between science, poetry, and imagination. I'm keen to learn. And during this presentation, I'd encourage you to use the Q&A box down there to start posting questions and things you'd like to talk about right from the beginning. We'll be here to answer them. If you drop out through Wi-Fi, you can come straight back in. And if you want to turn on subtitles, use the live transcript button also at the bottom of your screen. Will help you as we talk. So what I've asked our guests to do is each to come with a few minutes of an opening statement, helping me and helping us to explore these connections, and then we'll talk to them about them together. So we're going to start with the poets, and we're going to start with Katrina Porteous. Thanks for joining us, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm going to talk for a few minutes just about how I came to write about science, because it's a bit of a surprise even to me to be here at all. I would never have expected to write about science, because when I was about 12 years old and in school, I was asked to make a choice between studying science and studying the arts, which was very difficult and unfortunate, I think. But I chose the arts because I was good at them. But I was really interested in science as well, but I just couldn't do maths very well. However, I've always been interested in how the world works. So questions like time always really obsessed me, and structure and patterns, which of course are really the subject of poetry as well. So I felt that school, because I didn't study this subject, didn't give me the tools really to look at these things. I went to a very religious school. It was a church school. What it did give me was other tools, paradigms or stories or metaphors with which to explore the world. And these were interesting stories because they gave me sort of tools to think about paradoxes, really. For example, we were taught a lot about the incarnation, and that led me to think about how something can be simultaneously eternal and temporal. Simultaneously is, of course, a word that we're talking about time and not time there. The Holy Trinity, how can something be three things and one thing at the same time? And particularly for me, I was interested in free will and determinism. So once again, time and eternity, and how those two things can collide and be contemporaneous. And that sort of started me thinking in geometrical structures and patterns, which were already incorporated, I think, into some of my poetry. But it was this business about trying to deal with conflicting and paradoxical truths. Now, if we fast forward about 40 years to about 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to get a commission that enabled me to start a series of collaborative pieces, which Tom referred to in this book, Field. The first of these was about outer space and space exploration. The second was about field theory and quantum physics. And then the next one was about solar physics. And more recently, I've been writing about polar ice science. And I've been lucky enough to work with research scientists on some of these pieces, the last two of them at Northumbria University with their wonderful outreach department, NU STEM, which works with schools and in education. So later we might talk a bit about that and how that works. But the commission came about because of a very inspirational composer who I wanted to work with, someone I've known for many decades, called Peter Zinoviev. And Peter was a very, very interesting figure, is a very interesting figure, because he was a pioneer of computer music. He is probably the first person to have had a computer in a private house anywhere in the world. In the mid-1960s, he was using a computer to make music. But this was sampled music from natural sound. So this was a very, very early example of something that we all kind of take for granted now. And it was a confluence of mathematics, nature, culture, and science, I think. And Peter dropped out of composing for a long time, but came back to it about 10 years ago. So I've been able to work with him on these collaborative pieces. So I'm going to just read one of them without Peter's music. This is a piece from Field, and it's about electromagnetism. If there is a beginning, this is its signature, its first scribble. Not a continuum, only the sum of countless discrete shivers, a meaningless cipher that becomes gas, dust, and at least one exquisite accident, an instrument to interpret its imprint. Astonishing that across immense distance it should speak, cold and articulate as zigzags of light. And if an infant cannot translate, cannot receive its message, still it is born hardwired of the one unnegotiable grammar. So working with scientists for me has been completely life-changing and revelatory, especially I think the beauty and the symmetry of some of the equations which I can't possibly understand, but which I can look at on the page. And they're just amazing, the sort of transformations you see in them. Can it speak to you, I think, like music, really? So I found that profoundly comforting. And particularly after the loneliness and the coldness of outer space and the lovelessness of outer space, that beauty, I think, is a very internal and comforting thing. But as Tom said in his introduction, what it does is it puts the human in perspective. And it shows us simultaneously how vanishingly insignificant we are in the universe, and at the same time how completely miraculous it is to be alive and conscious. And as I think it was Carl Sagan said, the universe understanding itself. But at the heart of all of this, for me, lies our ability not simply to reason, but to come up with metaphors and stories. So I'd like to finish just with this thought about these Christian stories that I started out with, and behind them, the ancient Greek and the Platonic stories, which are so embedded in our culture and so shape the way that we think about things. I'll finish with a very, very short poem and then a question, which I'll put to the panel. This is a poem called Volcanoes of Io. You thought you knew what matter was, solid or gas or fluid. These words and their slippery properties, speed, heat, light, mass, one seething molten caldera, spitting gobs that cool on the surface into gleaming, desirable pennies, rolling back into the furnace like the old gods, slipping off their bodies out of mischief or pity. And the question I'd like to leave with is really, I'd like to know whether you think scientists from very different thought traditions, such as Chinese or African or Indian traditions, bring different paradigms to their science. And are we so shaped by our own paradigms that we tend to find what we're looking for? Thank you.
Katrina, thank you so much. How rich. I'd love to follow up with a lot of that, particularly the notation side of things. But before we do that, let's go to our other mainstream poet. Well, no one's mainstream here, but poet, Malcolm.
Thank you. It's lovely to be part of this conversation. Just that the conversation itself should take place seems to me to be a really hopeful thing if we're in the business of reintegrating. Tom mentioned that one of the figures I felt to be important was to this conversation was Coleridge, who himself obviously a great poet, a serious philosopher, and of course a friend of Humphrey Davies, the great pioneer in chemistry. Katrina just mentioned metaphors and the way in which the stories she'd inherited gave her metaphors for science. Coleridge wanted to think that science itself was continuously giving the poet metaphors. He used to say, I'm off to one of Humphrey Davies' lectures to increase my stock of metaphors, in the sense that he found that everything we find out about the working of things out there, in inverted commas, the more they become a kind of new language for us to understand what's in here. But what I'd really like to do in this brief time is to give you just briefly quote two accounts of poetry, which are meant to be purely of poetry, and simply open up for you to explore how much they might also be about science. And then I'm going to conclude with two short poems. So, famous account of poetry by Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream. He says, the poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. Now here's the key bit. As imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Now, that's hugely good about poetry and indeed about the other arts as well. But I wonder whether this thing of this beginning with observation, close observation, glance, everything is in the scope, heaven and earth, the invisible and the visible, all of it. And then this imaginative moment in which you body forth form, you look for form and coherence, form, shape, you make or construct something. Now, I know what that is to do with in a poem, but I wonder whether that's also to do with the imaginative leap that's involved in making a new scientific model. So there's Shakespeare. Now, Coleridge has a little interesting note written about 20 years later about what he and Wordsworth thought they were up to when they wrote the lyrical ballads and changed the course of English poetry. And this is what he says. He says, we weren't trying to lull you into some little fantasy world. He says this, we were trying to awaken the mind's attention and to remove the film of familiarity which our selfishness and solicitude has cast over this world, which is full of wonders, but we have eyes that see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. Now, again, that strikes me as being language with which any good scientist could work, that awakening the mind's attention. And indeed, I think there's some sense in which poetry is an instrument of observation, and it's like the sort of, you know, the curved surface, the beautifully polished and perfectly curved mirror of a telescope that's bringing into focus something that's always been there, but can now be seen in particular ways. And talking about poetry, write about science, I always love the fact that Gwyneth Lewis, the great Welsh poet, in her a lovely poetic sequence, Zero Gravity, a space elegy, writes about, it happened by chance, her cousin was one of the people who went up to help fix the Hubble mirror. And that becomes a very beautiful metaphor. That minor adjustment that brings things into focus becomes a beautiful metaphor for what poetry and science can do. So there's a couple of accounts of poetry from Coleridge and Shakespeare, and how might they, here's a question, how might they also be helpful for scientists? Now, I want to conclude with just very briefly with a couple of my poems. One is partly inspired by the delightful knowledge that Tom is actually a professor of natural philosophy. And I think there's something to be said for reviving the term natural philosophy in the way we talk about science, because science suggests a certain kind of hard and fast knowledge, scientia to know, but philosophy suggests a love of wisdom. Anyway, there's a very powerful and I think in many respects prophetic book, one of his most ignored books, by C.S. Lewis. It's not a Christian book. It's not a book of Christian apologetics. It's a philosophical inquiry into the nature of the way we know and what effect that has on our being human. And it's called, rather dauntingly, The Abolition of Man. It's just come out. There's a brand new commentary on it. It's just emerged, very good commentary by Michael Ward. It's been republished. Anyway, in that book, in the final chapter, Lewis calls for what he thinks of a new natural philosophy, a new science. He says it would not seek when it explained, it would not explain away. When it spoke of the parts, it would remember the whole. That seems to me a wonderful way of talking about what poetry might bring to science when it was explained. So anyway, I wrote a poem called a found poem. It's simply I felt nestling in this final chapter of Lewis about what a new and regenerate science could be, with some hints that would themselves make a poem. So this is a sonnet, but every word of it is taken here and there from Lewis's chapter. And this poem is just called Imagine. Imagine a new natural philosophy. I hardly know what I am asking for. Far off echoes, that primeval sense with blood and sap, man's prehistoric piety, continually conscious, continually alive and growing like a tree, and trees as dryads or as beautiful, the bleeding trees in Virgil and in Spenser, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life growing together, that great ritual pattern of nature, beauties branching out, the cosmic order, ceremonial, regenerate science, seeing from within. To participate is to be truly human. And that seemed to me to be somewhere in the realm that we're looking for. I'm going to finish, because this is a festival of ideas, by reading you a short poem which was inspired by going to a festival of ideas. This was a festival of ideas in another place in Cambridge, and I took the advantage of, there was going to be a lecture on string theory for which school children would be able to attend, so I thought that's probably about my level. I was thrilled by it. I was absolutely thrilled by the, as it were, the musical metaphor. It was illustrated throughout by playing both acoustic and electric guitars and having wonderful films of vibrating strings and boards. It was gorgeous. It so happened that evening I went back up to my college, where we had very beautiful 1662 Book of Common Prayer and a lovely antiphonally sung anthem. And yet the string theory and the choir exist in the same world, and indeed the string theory, if the string theory has anything in it, underpins what the choir is. So I wrote this poem called String Theory for Girton Choir, and it goes like this. In the beginning, only this, a sound whose waves expand, whose echoes still expend themselves in riffs of time and space, in overlapping amplitudes of bliss, pattering into patterns, into persons, into us. Conscious harmonics, singing face to face, resounding into music now, we trace in touches of a single string our source, flowing in everything. For everything in the beginning, in the end, is only this, a sound. And it's a shaped poem, so it looks like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm, for your vibrating node anti-node poem. Now let's go on to those who want to perhaps reflect on this from a little bit of a distance. Sam Illingworth, as I said before, from Napier University and editor of the Consilience Journal.
Thank you. And it's great to follow on from Katrina and Malcolm. I just want to pick up a couple of things they said. Katrina spoke about having to make a choice early on between the sciences and the arts. And Malcolm said a very lovely statement that poetry is an instrument of observation. And, you know, my work and my research is really concerned with developing dialogue between scientists and non-scientists and using poetry as a medium through which to engender that dialogue. And as part of that conversation, it's really important to realize that science and poetry aren't mutually exclusive entities, but rather complementary disciplines that help to lead to different ways to understand the beautiful world and the way in which we live. And the problem is, though, that society often wants to categorize people into pigeon holes, pigeon boxes, as scientist, poet, artist, dancer, whatever. Whereas we're just human beings with infinite potential. And so my work really tries to address that, to diversify science and to create a space in which other disciplines, and as Katrina touched on as well, other cultures move us away from a Western hegemony of thought. And one of the projects that I'm really delighted to be involved with is Consilience, which Tom mentioned, which is the world's first science and poetry peer-reviewed journal, which we set up at the beginning of last year. And the great thing about collaborations is taking the best bits from one field, I think, and applying it to another. And science has many failings, but one of its great ideas is peer review. So this idea that you submit your work knowing that it's not perfect, but knowing also that it's not imperfect. It's somewhere in between. And you can work with people in your field who are separate from your work to provide critique, to provide review, to provide improvement on the piece. Whereas it seems to me that when you submit a piece of poetry to a poetry journal, it's either perfect and accepted or imperfect and rejected. So instead at Consilience, what we do is we accept all poetry, and providing that it meets the theme of the issue, that it's loosely related to science and that it adheres to our statements of inclusivity. But then we work with our editors and our reviewers. We have a team of over 60 people across 6 of the world's continents, just Antarctica missing now. And we work with the poet, and sometimes it might just be this poem is brilliant, leave it as it is. And other times it might be, have you considered this inflection, or have you considered this additional bit of context, or have you considered this reformulation? And we're doing it to create a supportive environment in which both science and poetry have a space to explore the ways in which they make sense of the world. So I just want to share a poem with you, not written by me, but written by one of our poets. So in the last issue, which is all on the theme of failures, one of our poets, Clint Wastling, who's a very, very talented poet. I'll just put a link into the chat so people can see it as well. And in this poem, Clint is exploring the failures of maybe climate change mitigation scenarios around what will happen to to the coastal erosion of the East Riding of Yorkshire. And it's just called East of Zero by Clint Wastling. East gets less each year, the curse of stupidity like Canut forbidding high tide. We protect vital assets and leave softer landings south to its fate in the grey North Sea. East Riding, it marks final landfall before the Greenwich meridian touches the North Pole. Longshore drift erodes Easington, Kilnsea, ground to sediment deposited at Spurn. Earth is scooped away by the Holderness Ord, a worm of water uncoiling, twisting, making land sea again. Zero is imagined, a construct for longitude. In 100 years, nothing will lie east of here, and our house, 12 miles from the coast, will become littoral. And I think it's just a really, really nice poem that explores this idea that global interdisciplinary problems such as climate change are not going to be solved by just scientists. They're going to be solved by everybody. And we need to create a space in which all voices are welcome. And I think that poetry provides one way of doing that. And I just want to finish with another poem. It's very playful, by Robert Kelly, the famous American former children's laureate. And I think it just asks some questions that I think sometimes need answering. And it's just called Science by Robert Kelly. Science explains nothing, but holds all together as many things as it can count. Science is a basket, not a religion, he said. A cat as big as a cat. The moon the size of the moon. Science is the same as poetry, only it uses the wrong words. Thank you.
Sam, thank you so much. We'll be hearing a lot more from Consilience, I dare say. Now, I've said before, right from the beginning of the festival, opened by Anna with that extraordinary poetry and music moment in the Minster. And here she is again. Anna, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, Tom. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Katrina, Malcolm, and also Sam. When I know that I'm getting inspired, I get this like little fizziness inside and a little goosebumpy fizziness, and I definitely am getting that during this discussion. So thank you, Tom, for opening this space up. So I'm a violinist and musician and composer, and I work on cross-disciplinary projects. So my background is working as a violinist in bands, for bands, supporting the narrative of whichever artist I'm working with. But more over the last 10 years, I've been working across theatre, film, with the visual arts, and most recently in the last couple of years, also poets, but also science. So I'm obsessed with the idea of the creative process, and two parts of that fundamental to me are curiosity and collaboration. And I thought these were singular to the artist's role, you know, across any discipline. But actually, it was from that first panel discussion a couple of years ago, Tom, when I met scientists, and from talking to scientists and being in the laboratories, what drives them also is curiosity and collaboration. And for me, the music, Malcolm, you talked about the poetry being an instrument of observation. For me, I see music as the instrument of reflection, but also of emotional connection, and then also of changing perception and changing someone's perception of a certain topic. And I'm going to talk about two projects in science that I've done recently. One is with cancer research at the University of Kent, and one is with the European Space Agency. And basically what I'm fascinated when you collaborate with disciplines outside of your own, or with anyone, to be honest, is this space between. And I think you guys touched upon it, where you take people's, whether it's data, scientific data, or expertise, or knowledge, or or their ability to come up with words that give some sort of deeper meaning, but you create this space between, and this space allows for connection and interaction. But it also creates new emotional connections, and it also allows whatever those two disciplines, it allows it to be heard and seen by a wider audience. And what excites me about this space between is when you can change perception, and it changes the perception of me as an artist, or it changes the perception of the scientists I'm working with, and also other people. So with the cancer research project that I did, it was basically, I was asked to write a choral work for the University of Kent Chamber Choir. And I thought, oh, I've got this amazing opportunity to work in the Gulbenkian Theatre. It's got a huge screen. How about we make this an immersive event? And I was talking about this visual artist that I'd been working with. And I showed Daniel Harding, the conductor, I showed him these images. He said, oh, this reminds me of the research images in the bioscience department. You've got to meet the guys from the bioscience department. And so I met with Dr. Chris Toseland, and I said, just show me your images. Maybe I'll get some inspiration for this choral work. And I got that fizzy moment as soon as these first, tiny snapshots where you're flying on a molecular level into the nucleus of your inside. It looked galactic and it felt expansive, and I could hear music from just these first initial images. And I said, okay, I definitely want to work with you. But for me, it's not about a didactic kind of response, about telling. It's not about sort of telling the scientific data. It's about telling the story. Like Katrina, you were talking about story and narrative, and so I was asking, what is the narrative? What is the story you want to tell? So he was talking about scientists being in laboratories, that people think of cancer research, Alzheimer's research, with the cancer fund runs, or the personal experience of either yourself or a family member or friends experiencing cancer or Alzheimer's. So my idea was to take these cancer images and not do this incredible composer, Ioannis Xenakis. Oh my God, I can never pronounce his surname. But he wrote this piece on cancer, which was absolutely, it sounds like cancer looks like and feel. It's these morph chords, which discordant, which spreads and spreads until it's taking up the range of the entire orchestra, and this cacophony of noise, and it's disturbing. And I thought, I want to change the perception of these cancer images and do something which feels accessible and beautiful and melodic. So you're showing the work in a different way. And my favorite thing is when the scientists, you're basically putting their work, you're blowing it up onto a huge level. So their connection to their own work changes, which makes them look back at their own research in a different way, because then suddenly they're seeing the emotional connection of an audience with their own work. And that was such an incredible experience, because I also went into the laboratories and said, I want to do some field recordings to underpinning this choral work were sort of field recordings. And they said, absolutely. So I went in with my microphone and they said, but there's no music here. And I said, hang on a minute, what's that? This vacuum. I was like, I'm going to record that. And then I'm going to record, the shaking of bacteria in molecules in the beads, where they sort of shake it. And it makes this kind of really interesting rhythmic sound. And then what I loved was I could tell at first they thought I was slightly crazy, but as I was getting enthusiastic about all the music that was happening in the laboratory, they suddenly said, oh, and this makes something, and this makes it. So even just changing their perception of what their own surroundings are, even though that really excited me. And the pinnacle was a brilliant Dr. Natalie Philly, who works with cancer research. I got her to get some bottles, and she listened to some early recordings of the choral work. And I said, I want you to play laboratory bottles. She said, but I'm not a musician. I said, it doesn't matter. And so she closed her eyes and she played these bottles, and they underpin quite a lot of the work. I've left those in because it was this emotional response to her own work. It was kind of a full circle, and it creates this space between, which was not pre-existing. It's this new space. And I think that is so exciting when art can change. It's the coming together of art and science. And I've probably run out of time, but really quickly, the European Space Agency was similar as well, where I was asked to write a 10-minute piece on, as part of the O2, it was a big thing, the European Space Agency Space Rocks Festival, and I was doing a talk, I was doing a performance alongside Tim Peake and lots of incredible astronauts and scientists from the European Space Agency. And I said, oh, for me to find out what should I write about, I had as preconceived ideas that I was going to do music of the spheres, a reimagining of Holst and exploring new worlds. But I went to visit, I said, oh, I'd love to come and visit the Technological Space Centre in Holland. And after my visit, spending 8 hours talking to scientists there, I suddenly dawned on me, the story is not about what's happening out there. Like the Cancer Reset, it's about looking back down on planet Earth and space technology being used to understand the Earth we live in and to combat climate crisis. And so that's when I wrote this 10-minute piece. And so it's just the idea of this conversation that changes perception. And that's what excites me. And I guess my question that I would ask the panel or the audience is that when you feel in the moment, when you've hit upon an idea, whatever discipline you're from, do these ideas pre-exist in the ether? And are we just channeling those in some kind of scientific, or is it a religious? The question is, where do they pre-exist? And are we just in the right time at the right moment and open to those to kind of, and then translate them through whatever form our discipline has? So that's
or are we
question.
creating them, or are we creating them de novo?
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much. What about your fizzy moments? I think you've given us all fizzy moments throughout all that. And thank you, everyone. There are some really interesting questions coming in the Q&A. Well, you just be patient just for a few more minutes, because what I'd love to do first is just to hear very briefly, once round the panel, responding to some of the questions and thoughts that they've thrown up, as it were, on the platform here, before we open it up to the audience and take some of those. So as I guess I went first, I'm going to illustrate the brevity with which we will do this by saying that when Malcolm mentioned the Shakespeare quote many years ago, long before I'd heard him say that, when I got to Act 5 A Midsummer Night's Dream and read that, my science experience immediately resonated. I remember having an Anna Phoebe fizzy moment and saying, he's talking about what I do. That's what it feels. Giving to airy nothing a local habitation and a name is what I do. And then, in terms of, someone else said it in another interesting way. George Steiner, I've got to read one sentence. So again, by the way, I didn't expect Katrina to get theological on us. I expected Malcolm to. So this is really interesting. But George Steiner writes a book on art and humanities in a sort of postmodern world deprived of connection as a post-Holocaust atheist Jew. But he writes about the Christian idea of Trinity and presence, because it's his vehicle. Now, at one point, he's talking about why we do art, and he writes, only art can go some way towards making accessible, towards waking into some measure of communicability the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. And I remember my fizzy moment reading that. I said, yes, George, yes, art, but science too. That's what science, what else could waken into commensurability the inhuman otherness of matter, as Katrina has written, as you, Malcolm, have written for us today. And then that takes on to Goethe, who is not read nearly as much as he should be for his science. And Goethe, who does what Malcolm suggests we should do, and Sam, and hold the local and the holistic together in a proper science. And Goethe also said that science and poetry have forgotten their common origin, and that's haunted me ever since. So those are my couple of pennyworths. So round quickly, and it was Katrina first, wasn't it? Katrina, quick response.
Quick response. Well, it was wonderful to hear everyone's perspective, particularly because I don't know Anna's work or Malcolm's, or indeed Sam's, well at all. I thought that the word observation came up several times in different contexts in the conversation, and I think that's a really important part of the root of what science and the arts have in common. It's about this close attention and close and faithful attention to the world, and in this, again, rather paradoxical way, not trying to impose our own ideas on the world, but about trying to receive from the world what the world is telling us. And as a poet, I feel that very strongly, and that was something that came up in what you said, Malcolm, about Wordsworth and Coleridge, and I also heard it in what Anna and Sam were both saying. And then secondly, this business about that Anna talked about, so and indeed embodied, Anna, in your performance just now, your sense of this sort of emotional connection, which I think is so important, and in a way underrated by science. I mean, I get the sense that science and scientists in our culture, I might be wrong in this, but I get feedback from scientists sometimes where I get the sense that the arts are kind of deprioritized as a sort of second-rate way of describing the world. And of course, science is what gives us the truth, and arts can only give us the sort of second-hand truth in describing what science does. But I think this business of our emotional response is so important, because it is what distinguishes us as human beings. Machines can do logic. Machines do logic really well, and probably better than we do. And, AI and so forth will show us that in the future. But what machines cannot do is sympathetic response, or certainly not so far. And that's something that I think it has really come across in all of this discussion so far.
Thanks, Katrina. On the roots to knowledge, I know Malcolm will have something to say, but he may have something else to say as well. Malcolm.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it was lovely to hear all these different perspectives. I think a couple of things that come out of it for me. One is, I think several people have talked about complementary ways of knowing. And of course, talking about this whole thing of when you create a space in between, a meeting between different approaches. And I think one of the things we need to address is a reintegration of the complementary ways of knowing, which are shown in reason and imagination. I mean, there's a very proper place for each. I found in one of C.S. Lewis's essays, he has a very helpful little kind of it's almost an aphorism where he says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. In other words, I do need a certain kind of rigorous, logical and possibly atomizing and specializing kind of knowledge to get at certain kinds of truth. And I need to know that those truths are the case, whatever my emotional feeling about them. But that's not sufficient. The whole of them is not just in the establishment of a fact, but in the understanding of its meaning in a larger thing. So I think we need to reintegrate these things. But that links with another thing. I really liked what Anna was saying about when she was doing the space project. I'm glad you found time to slip that one in. That you were expecting it to do this cosmic, new music of the spheres, Holst, everything. And you suddenly said it wasn't up there, it was down here. And I'd like to put a complementary pairing to that as saying, it's not just out there, it's in here. That you bring the focus down not only to the work that's being done by the European Space Agency that actually helps us to understand the Earth, but let's bring it even further in. Let's think for a moment about the thinking of the scientists, about the astonishing miracle that a bit of the universe is thinking about itself, that a reflective consciousness is there, which is a kind of categorically different thing. And one of the things that I found, I think several people have mentioned, Katrina certainly mentioned, this false choice that we were offered at 12 or 13 or 14, are you arts or are you science? I was made to do that too, and I also went into the arts. I wanted to do a science as well. I wanted to do biology A-level, but they wouldn't, alongside my English, and they wouldn't let me do it. But I think the thing that I found particularly difficult, I remember I came late into the English school system, and our first chemistry lesson, I'd never studied chemistry at all, and we were doing acids and alkalis, and we were using bits of litmus paper, and I was enchanted. I mean, I just was astonished to actually witness the change in the color of the paper. And we had to write up the homework. And I wrote it up. I mean, I wrote in all the measurements and what changes were made and the actual things that you were expected to put in. But I also have to say, the proto teenage poet in me waxed lyrical. And I said, this is just the most beautiful thing. And I didn't understand the relations between these two things. I didn't see how one could be transformed. And I was amazed when the paper changed color. And when I got my homework back, there was a red line crossing out every time I'd used the word I, every time I'd expressed any sense that this was astonishing. And I was held up, made to stand up in front of the class while my work was trashed. I mean, nobody had ever told me how you're supposed to write this stuff up anyway. And I said, what's the problem? All of this is true. And he said, all we want is the results and your observations, but we don't want you to say you observed them. And I said, well, how am I supposed to write it? How can I say, if I say, I saw the litmus paper change color? And he said, no, you must say, it was observed that the litmus paper changed color. And I said, what, as if nobody was there? And he said, yes, it isn't scientific, it isn't objective if you bring in this subject observer. And apart from being ritually humiliated in front of the class, I also knew from that moment that there was something false about all of this. There was something suspect about the entire endeavor. If your endeavor to learn about things began by presuming there was no learner, that your observation presumed no observer, and then had nothing to say about the experience of the observer. So I was very delighted later when I read my Noddy's Book of Quantum to discover that, that actually the observer is part of the problem. So I think that split that we need to heal goes deep, and when, it comes out of the Enlightenment, but we really need to address it at a school level as well as at a university level.
And people mentioned education before, and let me just say, it's going to be the majority of a career in science behind me. What people sometimes get at school, as you did, is a misrepresentation of science, and that was that way of articulating that horrendous passive voice is part of an early modern decision of how to articulate science that I think was optional and has been in fact extremely damaging for reasons that you said. Yeah. But because we must have time for these questions, and I think it was Sam next, isn't it? Yeah.
So I guess just to follow on from what Malcolm and Katrina were saying as well, in terms of healing these rifts, and I'm sure most people are aware that the choice between science and the arts wasn't always thus, and that back in the Renaissance and before, people were doing both. And Katrina said something really interesting, that sometimes I feel scientists and science has like the dominant thought that we're the ones who are allowed to make the discoveries. But listen to this passage, right? Written by Erasmus Darwin, who was a poet and also like a botanist. This was written in 1791. Star after star from heaven's high arch shall rush, suns sink on suns and systems crush, headlong extinct to one dark center fall, and death and night and chaos mingle all. So this is an extract from 1791 where Erasmus Darwin was talking about the Big Crunch. So the idea that the universe expands and then comes back in on itself. And, we have other examples in literature, like Poe famously wrote about the Big Bang in his prose piece, Eureka. And so it isn't scientists that have, are the only people who are allowed to do this, or who have done that in the past, indeed. And I also agree with Tom that we should be reading much more Goethe. And, I just want to finish this small précis with it, to continue that quote. So Goethe's got one of my favorite quotes about interdisciplinarity, where he says that science arose from poetry, and when times change, the two can meet again on a higher level as friends, which I just think is a really beautiful piece.
Well, let's hope we're taking Goethe's vision and bringing it one step closer today. Wouldn't that be an exciting thought? Anna, brief final reflection from you on what everyone else has said so far.
Well, I continually inspired by, especially the references and the poetic and literary references. I want to just refer to someone in the chat who's asked, do you think there needs to include scientific evidence, so not to misinform or use some perspective to add meaning and opinion to describe things and make them more interesting? And I think that is an interesting point. And I'd be interested to hear what you think. But I see my role as a composer and an artist as I'm limited within my own social construct, my own experiences, and I am limited to my own emotions. So I see it as an emotional response or a platform for other people's ideas. I don't see myself as as a didactic way of telling people what to think. And I think definitely I always would reference the science in my work. It's there in the footnote, especially when you're dealing with European Space Agency, because you do not want to get their lawyers on your case. So I always definitely reference back. But what I try and offer is a different way of thinking or a different platform. And I think it goes back to what Katrina said when she said this mathematical equation, she doesn't understand it, but it's beautiful and it's patterns. And I think it's just about that human connection of trying to make those connections. And I also think it goes back to Katrina, what you also brought out. I mean, look, here we are, 5 white people on a Zoom call. We are limited by our Western constraints in Hindu philosophy, and also, you know, not just going back, you talked about the Renaissance, Sam, but not going back that far in Eastern philosophy. Anushka Shankar, who I know, Nitin Sawhney, who I work with, who are very mathematical. They are polymath, because in the very essence of the music is maths and it's science and it's data driven within the music. So I think actually it's the Western constructs that are quite limited. And I think if you were to look further afield, maybe you don't have those rifts that people, you know, we were talking about today.
And further back in time too, let's not forget in the medieval curriculum, music was one of the mathematical arts in the quadrivium, along with geometry and astronomy. So we can learn spatio-temporally too. Let's take a couple of questions together on opportunities, if needs for science and poetry and the arts to work together. I think so. Chris Lane asks, does the paradigm shifting work of the American Academy of Advancement of Post-Materialist Science, emphasis on consciousness, does that open new opportunities for poetry, understanding consciousness? And perhaps we'll couple that with Ian Hughes, who points out in our cascading crises, as he writes beautifully in our age, climate, authoritarianism, division, nuclear threat, and so forth. Do science and arts have a new and more urgent shared agenda to reimagine a new and more just world? So perhaps opportunities, anyone?
I think the question of consciousness is really a very central question. Whether we try and start with a presupposition of exterior cold dead things interacting and then sort of accidentally producing consciousness as a sort of accidental add-on, or whether we begin with the notion that we have a primal experience of consciousness, out of which comes all kinds of things, including our relationships with the apparently external world and our science. I think Coleridge wrote in the margin of his copy of might have been Leibniz, no, it's Spinoza. Anyway, he basically wrote, he said there are really only 2 primal statements from which you can start thinking. Either it is, in which case eventually you're going to have to see whether you can work out how there could ever be an I am, a personal out of it is. And he says, I don't think you're going to get very far with that one. Or you can start with I am, which you have experience of, and then say, can I arrive at some kind of it is? And can I describe what that is? So I do think that we have to integrate consciousness into somewhere. Just to pick up the second bit of that, but it's not unrelated. I think one of the deepest problems ecologically, the whole crisis has come from, as it were, a kind of denaturing or disenchanting or demythologizing, depersonifying nature. So we've islanded value and personhood entirely inside the concavity of our own skulls and said, well, we've got this just subjectively, but out there it's just a big agglomeration of stuff. And it's because we have that attitude to the world that it's just a big agglomeration of stuff without value, because value is only a subjective thing. That's why we're trashing it. Whereas, to go back to this cultural comment that Anna was raising, you know, our own culture until the last 200 or 300 years, and practically every other culture that's thriving, has not had an it relationship, but some kind of I-thou relationship with matter. And therefore there's been mutuality, there's been courtesy, there's been respect, there's been reverence, there's been a whole range of responses which a particular kind of Western science deliberately marginalized. And part of bringing science and poetry back together is to get an approach to the world which is more mutually reverent and courteous, and that itself will be part of the solution to the climate problem.
Yeah. I think actually sometimes Peter Meadow reflects this in some of his writing about imagination and creativity in science, where he says that the difference between artistic and scientific imagination, also actually in some sense reflecting Wordsworth in Lyrical Ballads on this, is that the artistic imagination travels. We all get it, we connect it, it's communally shared, we all understand the painting. But the scientific one, he doesn't. It stays in the mind of the scientist. It doesn't really travel. It's sort of hyper individualized. So I wondered if part of the breaking out that poetry can give to science is to connect us together in ways that things like Anna's performance connects.
And yet, I mean, you talk about science as being very particularized in that way, and you're right, Tom. But from another perspective, it's the other way around, isn't it? Science is international and universal. The truths of science are universally true. And in talking about consciousness, science is able to expand our physical senses both out into the enormous things that we couldn't otherwise perceive and tiny things that we can't perceive with our senses. Our physical senses are very limited, but science enables the extension of those senses in a very universal way, which is not particular to any nationality or any group of people. It's universally true. So some would say that the arts are more particular in the sense that you're talking about. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I think that takes us on to a little cluster of questions around beauty and aesthetics that I'd like us to have a chew on. And again, I take a few together. So Suzanne Kalker refers Sabine Hossenfelder, who's actually a wonderful publicist, communicator for science, got a great YouTube channel actually, but she can also be quite critical and limited. Suzanne says she's a prominent atheist physicist, but she says beauty is leading physics astray now. So that by looking for beauty, as Dirac once said he looked for in theory, with obsessed physicists obsessed with beauty, other physicists like Wilczek see beauty as fundamental to the physics of the universe. Does atheism lead to a denial of beauty? So there's a counter-theological question. Then while we're on aesthetics, Trishala asks, people don't usually look out for the beauty around us in the fast-pacing scientific world. We're taught to look and believe in a scientific way, yet beauty and poetry take a backseat. What are your thoughts on this? So might poetry re-haunt the mine, reweave the rainbow for the science that's disentangled aesthetics?
I think this is really interesting because I think that it's a bit of a straw man argument. This when science removes the beauty of the world. Like I couldn't disagree more. Like all of us, like no matter what practice we have, be it theology, be it poetry, be it art, be it science, be it music, I think we can all appreciate that the more we find out about something, actually, the more we realize we don't know, and the more mystical it is, and the more beautiful it is. And whilst we shouldn't necessarily look for beauty just for beauty's sake, I think that once we're looking at, the Fibonacci sequence repeating in pine cones, how can you not say that that's incredibly beautiful? And, for me, being a lapsed physicist myself, I remember for learning about those microseconds after the world was first created. And I think that's beautiful that we can look back to a few seconds after the entire creation and have some inkling of what's going on. And so for me, I actually think that science offers answers towards an understanding beauty. But again, I don't want to steer this towards religion, but I think a lot of the issues that people have maybe are sometimes the dichotomy that exists between science and religion, and the central tenet of faith, faith from a religious perspective, but also faith from a scientific perspective in terms of the ideas that you're creating and going forward from that. I just want to briefly mention a poem here, because there was another question as well that asked about what I think it was SLAC asked for poems to recommend that explore the beauty of nature and science.
Yes.
And I think that there's one here from, people probably know this one, but the Christina Rossetti poem, Who Has Seen the Wind, which I'll just read briefly. I think it's a beautiful example of this and this idea of faith, beauty, and science. Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you. But when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing through. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by.
Thank you, Sam. So on emotions and aesthetics, Katrina or Anna, do you have any anything to add here? Perhaps in your own artistic process, do you find that aesthetics and or the emotion generative of what you do?
Well, I don't, aesthetics is not on my mind during my creative process, to be honest. I want to tell the story, and I'm responding to my own emotional connection to the story. So aesthetics, you know, with the European Space Agency piece, I knew that it was going to be shown at an event where there were young children, scientists, space scientists, and an adult audience as well. So knowing how to, and for me it was like, I want people to respond to I made a film out of their research as well. So I wanted them to pay attention and respond to the film. So that was slightly different, because my intention was to get as many people's attention for those 10 minutes and to respond to the film and tell the story. So for me, it's always, you know, in music we have that thing for the good of the show, and that is what drives my work. It's I want these voices to be heard. I think also aesthetics, I don't think it always has to be beautiful. I like the juxtaposition. So for instance, York Festival of Ideas, the opening piece, so I was performing, the music was from my Sea Souls album, and it's about a response to the psychological turmoil of last year, responding through the nature, through the sea, where I live and I'm inspired by. And we filmed and recorded that in York Minster. And so with two musicians, but then juxtaposed to that emotion of this quite emotive music were poets who were talking about sexual violence against women, about rape, about their experiences as women, social activism. And it's about taking those two things and creating a space where two opposing aesthetics in terms of the nature of what is being told is creating something new. And I think the Royal Academy artists I was just speaking to, you know, I know we talk about safe spaces, and I do, you know, that's a whole other thing. But I think the role of art is to challenge challenge and expose. And sometimes the aesthetics of that is pleasing, and sometimes it isn't. But that's
Georges Braque said, didn't he, that the job of science was to reassure, and the job of art was to disturb. He said it in French, but I mean, and again, something I couldn't agree more, but I couldn't disagree more rather with that, because I think they both could be disturbing, but also reassuring in the sense of making connection. But I wanted to just reflect on a question we had from Steve here, who asked, would the panel agree that both scientists and poets start with observation and only deviate in their methods of description as a scientist who writes poetry?
So you've frozen, Tom, but perhaps I could just pick up on that thing about starting. I think start is the important word there. That I said that poetry was an instrument of observation, and I wanted to do that to counterbalance the idea that poetry is just about your feelings or just about some inward world. I wanted to say that poetry cleanses this mirror and allows you to see things. Shakespeare says again, it holds a mirror up to nature. But it doesn't end with observation. That what poetry and the arts can do is to take observation and reframe it in a new context. So it's not just an isolated observation, it's an observation, to borrow a word that Anna's used quite a lot, it's an observation which becomes part of a story, your story or my story, or two stories meeting in the space that the artist has created for them to meet. So then the observation has a chance to acquire resonance and meaning. But there must be some real observation. We can't just write endless, vapid, self-referential stuff about some inaccessible private experience. I don't think that makes for good poetry or good science. I think we have to be humbled by and humble towards the things as they are and really see them. But then we can reframe them in this extraordinary, exciting new way.
I think that's a really good point, Malcolm. And I think, Steve writes that they're a scientist who writes poetry. And, that reminds me of Miroslav Holub, the famous Czech immunologist and poet. And I know that he wrote on his processes being similar for writing. And Steve, it'd be really interesting to know if, as a scientist and a poet, if your own processes were similar in the way that you approach these things. I personally think it would be a really interesting scientific experiment to get somebody to do a scientific experiment and write a poem at the same time, and to see what was going on with their brain signals, to see if they were using different parts of their brain. In fact, Malcolm, we could get you to do it, because I love the idea of your poetic write-up of a scientific experiment. And that's something I do when we go into schools. We encourage people to do that exact thing, because it's much more interesting. We don't necessarily need to have introduction, methods, analysis, conclusion. I would have loved to have seen your your poetic interpretation of litmus paper, and I think it would have been just as revealing. So yeah, I think that's to be commended, Malcolm, and I hope it's
nice to hear that 50-something years after the event, when I got minus. But no, but it's funny how these things do mark you. But yeah, I was delighted to hear that Steve was a scientist writing poetry. I think the more we can get that going together, the better.
And just to add to that, there are many poets and artists now working in schools to promote science. I mean, I've been doing a little of that myself with NU STEM, and working with children who perhaps might find science difficult for whatever reason, but that by working with the arts, by writing poetry about it, or creating visual art or music on a theme to do with science, they're finding a way into it. So it becomes again an emotional connection to find a way into doing science that is both scientific and artistic. You can't really separate the two.
I was going to, I'm sorry I dropped out there for a little while due to a technical hitch, but back on here, and I may have missed this. But what I was going to say is that what fascinated me in talking with poets and artists and painters and chemists and mathematicians and engineers and physicists about their creative process was how their stories were similar in how the original vague idea of what this poem or song or painting or physics theory or chemical reaction might be, and their imaginative route to getting it, to getting there. This is what I meant by the underplaying of imagination in science. And I remember Malcolm showing me how Coleridge and others thought imagination reminded us rather, Goethe always knew, imagination is as much a source of knowledge as observation. So this was in response to Steve's question about observation, and whether you think that there's something theological here as well. We've talked about theological patterns of Trinity and resurrection, but made in the image of God. And I wondered whether a theological that idea helps us answer one of Anna's questions about what we do when we do science. Is it creative or discovery? And I wondered whether, if the creator creates the actual physical world, I know as a scientist, I don't experience the actual physical world, I experience the idea of it, but maybe as an image, I create an image of that real world. And that is what science and also arts do. Are we creating images of what we experience and see around us in a very important way, not to denigrate that?
Yeah, just quickly to respond to that. I mean, this was something that was kind of the whole heart of second half of Coleridge's life, was reflecting precisely on this. And one of his things, first of all, was to recognize, which I think is much more widely recognized now, which is, if you like, the element of constructing a world as we perceive it. That all perception, including the perception of the scientist and the perception of the poet, the perception of the world as we see it in appearances, as opposed to its atomic or subatomic, things, the surfaces, is a kind of imaginative shaping. And he called the imagination the living power and prime agent of all perception, that there's already an imaginative shaping to perceive coherence in the world at all. But that isn't to say the same thing as we're making it up, or there isn't any truth in that shaping. So he goes on to say, and this is, if you like, more theologically contentious, but this is his idea. He says that imaginative act of perceiving that we're doing all the time, whereby we have a world and faces and beauty and people rather than just a stream of uninterpreted data, that shaping, he says, Coleridge says, is, and I'm quoting him directly here, is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. In other words, he sees the observable world as something that sort of shimmers into being collaboratively between the mind of God and the mind of us observing it, which is exactly like a poem. I mean, if I send you all a poem and you read it in a book, it's just a bunch of jiggles in black on white paper, or waves on an oscilloscope if I speak it. And you could study it for years, its physicality, and not have the faintest idea that it was a poem. But when it does become a poem, in order for you to love my poem or Katrina's poem, you have to be a poet too. You are making the poem in your mind out of our signals, just as much as we made it when we made the signals. And in fact, you may be making a better poem. You may be a better reader than I am a poet. You know, I may have given you, you may dance a better dance in your mind than the one I did when I wrote it. So Coleridge thinks that there's something like that going on.
That's wonderful.
Whenever we God.
Yeah, I know Katrina wants to respond to that briefly, and I've got my eye on the clock, we're running out, but Katrina, go ahead.
Well, two things very, very briefly in response to that. First of all, that just reminds me again of quantum theory and how the decisions are made by the observer rather than by the wave or the particle. So there's that. But there's also, as you were speaking, Malcolm, it just made me think, well, Coleridge was interpreting that in his sort of Christian paradigm, but it takes us back to Plato, doesn't it, and to the Plato's cave, and to what we're all sitting at the bottom of the cave seeing something projected on a screen, which is very, very partial and very secondary and sort of subject to what our eyes see. So again, we are thinking about this within the paradigm of a very old tradition of Western thought. And I still want to know whether, if we weren't Western and we hadn't all come from Plato and the Socratic tradition, whether we would be thinking in the same way. Is this something neurological? Is it to do with the structure of the brain? Is it universal to humanity? Or is it part of our cultural tradition?
I suspect we will have to leave some of those questions and the other hundreds hanging. Just as I make some final remarks, I wonder if people, my colleagues here, might in the chat share with our Slack coordinator, homeschool art and science teacher, their ideas on top 5 poets who speak about the wonder and beauty of nature. One of them is right here, of course. Her name's Katrina Porteous. And there may be other ideas. I mean, they're all going to know. So we could multitask on that one. But yeah, the clock has caught us. Thank you so much, everybody. Katrina Porteous, Anna Phoebe, Malcolm Guite, Sam Illingworth. I am bursting with excitement. It's been what did Anna call them, a massive hour fizzy moment for me, and a huge amount to take away from. So thank you so much. Thank you also very much to our audience. Without you, this wouldn't happen. Apologies for those of you who didn't quite get an answer to all the questions, but please come back and please contact us. We don't keep our contacts private. If you want to read more, then our festival bookseller Fox Lane Books has all the books. Be in touch with Kirsty at Fox Lane Books. She'll sort you out for any of those we've mentioned or beyond. And we do hope you'll watch again or have friends who want to watch again. This will be on YouTube from a few hours time. Please pass the good word around and keep bringing all our disciplines together. Let's keep mending our fragmented world at schools, universities and beyond to help heal our world and our planet. Please particularly pay particular attention out not only to all the events in the York Festival of Ideas, but the two more remaining in this sequence of science, imagination, the big ideas. Tomorrow I'll be joined by Dr. Amanda Rees from our sociology department, and also Dr. Francisca Colt from the same department, and the Equipping Christian Leaders in Age of Science project, who will be talking about conflict metaphor in science and also the pandemic and whether that's helpful. And on Friday evening, I'll be joined one-on-one in conversation with Krista Tippett from the American Public Broadcasting award-winning On Being series on science, the world, philosophy, spirituality, and everything. And with that, I'm going to thank you and our guests, and for now say goodbye, au revoir, thank you.